This week, I've been thinking a lot about stories, in part because we've had people be baptized today and all throughout the day and even later onto Wednesday, because each of them have a story. It's a story of their life and how God has intersected in their life and his part in it and all of those kinds of things. And story is a really powerful thing. It can alter a day for us. In fact, some of us, a good story is an escape, right? You make it through your whole workday. You deal with all those knuckleheads that share space with you and projects with you. You get home, you maybe have some decent food, and what's the first thing we all think to do? Netflix. Right? Netflix or Hulu or whatever the case may be, because there's something about getting engrossed in a really great story, whether that's a movie or a TV show, or if you really want to go crazy and read books. You love a good story because then you don't have to think about the day. You don't have to think about the challenges and you don't have to think about the letdowns. You can just kind of get lost in whatever's happening with the characters and the story arc. In some ways, a good story is an explanation. I don't know if you are like this, but sometimes for me, I feel locked up in life and I'm not sure how to sort it all out and figure it all out. And every once in a while, I'll watch a movie or I'll watch a good episode and it will kind of explain something to me and a light bulb will go off and I can now navigate my way through it. Story is just a powerful thing. It might excite you. Some of you have given to initiatives or you've shown up at events or you've been a part of something because a great story was told. It wasn't because a good argument was given. It's because you got excited about this person and the way that their life has unfolded. Story is a really powerful thing. Now, if you ask me, the greatest story ever told, you're going to say Jesus. You're going to think that's what I'm going to say. I actually think the greatest story and movie ever made is Star Wars. It's hands down the best. And we can argue about it all day, but I'm going to win because it's the best story. I mean, this movie franchise has made $47 billion with a B dollars since it first came out in 1977. A lot of us grew up on Star Wars. We watched it over and over again. I remember being 9 years old and watching it for the first time and thinking this was amazing, lightsabers and blasters and all of these characters that had been made real from somebody's brain, and it was just the coolest thing I'd ever seen. But I got sad because I got to the third movie, and that was it. There was nothing left. And the creator of the movies had said, we're not going to tell any more stories. This is it. He must have felt like he got it right the first time, so why mess with it? But his mind changed a little over a decade later. And he decided that he was going to put out not sequels to the movie. We all knew what a sequel was. He was going to put out something called a prequel. These were going to be the stories that came before the stories that I grew up on, the stories that I knew so well. And now here's an interesting thing about doing it that way. The end of the story that you're going to write now has already been told. It's already been determined. So everything you do in the prequel needs to lead to that ending. It needs to lead to Darth Vader. He has to come into existence. This is the whole reason we're going to have these initial stories so that we can learn what drove him to become so evil. He's widely regarded as the best and greatest villain of all time. How did he get there? But you know, and I know, as we watch those prequels, this guy that seems pretty good right now is not going to stay good. And at some point, he's going to get all caught up in a black suit and breathe weird and talk with a much deeper voice than he is right now. We knew that had to happen. Why? Because we knew the story. So everything decided, everything written, everything that was put into the new story had to lead to that destination. That's what's so fun about a story, is that there are twists and turns and ups and downs, but it's ultimately always leading somewhere. Story will always take you in a direction. Whether you are a big Harry Potter fan, Lord of the Rings fan, Star Wars fan, you fill in the blank of your favorite thing to read over again and watch over again. Isn't it funny? You know the end. but you want to watch it again because it was that good. It's not unlike when we decide we're going to go for a drive. Whether it's Sunday afternoon or it's just been a long day, we're going to go for a drive and kind of wander for a little bit. You know where nobody goes for that? The interstate. No, nobody's like, I'm going to get on a road that just goes straight for a really long time. We will go find the twistiest, turniest road imaginable because that's exciting. That's fun. That's what a good story will do. It's moving you in unexpected directions, but ultimately you know it's going to end in a specific place. When you go for a drive, at least I hope that you're hoping you end up at home. At some point, you will have to make a decision to turn this way and that way at the right time in order to get back to where you started. Or if you're going out to some place, you know where that place is. You have the ending. So the story you're going to tell as you go, in some ways, gets determined for you. You don't have to make choices because you want to get where you're going. That's the power of story. And it's why story is going to be a part of this list of questions that I want to introduce you to over the course of the next month or so. Because I'm obsessed with really good questions. I think the best story writers, I think the best decision makers actually ask themselves good questions. It's better than a pro-con chart. It's better than Googling it. A lot of us, that's how we solve problems these days. We just ask Google. And now that we have AI, we do that a lot too. Like, what does this random computer think I should do? But there is a way for you and for me to sit for just a few extra minutes and come to some wise, prudent decisions. But it starts with good questions. Because as we wrestle through those, and we have the end in mind, or the final destination in mind, it helps us when we come to the fork in the road, know which way to go. Where do I want to end up? What do I want to be true? Where do I want to go? That's different than thinking like, what is the problem right now? It's always looking ahead, which we've pulled from one sentence in the book of Proverbs. It was written by what we largely consider the wisest person to ever live. He put it this way. This is what we're anchoring this entire series on. A prudent person sees trouble coming and ducks. A simpleton walks in blindly and is clobbered. And unfortunately, even though none of us are simpletons, a lot of us feel clobbered, week in and week out. Some of us got to our 30s, to our 40s, and we look back over the last couple decades and we go, what in the world happened? How did I end up here? And sometimes we'll slip into victim mode, that all of those things that led me here happened to me. Someone did them to me. I wasn't a part of that. And we've talked a little bit about having to take ownership. Part of the taking ownership is asking really good questions. And I think the first and most important one has to do with your story. The question I want to introduce you today it's the main point. It's also the point of application. Like, if you're going to do something this week with anything that I say, it's going to center around this question. And for me, this question has literally changed my life. I was introduced to it maybe 5-6 years ago. And as I walked into some of the most uncertain times of my life, it was this question that anchored me and helped me make some decisions about how I was going to navigate these chapters. I couldn't avoid the chapters, but how I was going to navigate them. So I'd like to introduce you to it. I hope you'll memorize it. It's this one. What story do I want to tell? When this is just a story that I'm sharing with my children or my grandchildren or somebody I will meet 15 years from now, and I'm telling them a story from my life or the story of my life, what do I want that story to be? That changes the way we navigate the fork in the road. It forces us to wrestle with, where do I want to end up? The day that I sit around a Thanksgiving table or around a Christmas tree, and my grandchildren say, Grandpa, Grandma, will you tell me the story about when you were 25 years old? you're going to go, you got two choices, right? It's either like, yeah, I'm going to pretend you didn't ask me that. Or let me tell you about some decisions I made that I'm glad I made. And I made those decisions with you in mind, with this moment in mind, because I thought about when this was just a story I was telling, which story do I want to tell? Now, this is so important. It's so important because you and I, we write our story one decision at a time. You can have a 5, 10, 15, 50-year plan, but if you don't make decisions in this moment that lead you in that direction, all of those goals will be unrealized. You will find yourself in some waypoint station, lost and unable to find your way back onto the road. Because your decisions are happening in real time. And I know we always say, like, at least my kids used to say, YOLO, right? You only live once, so live in the moment and make the most of it. And there's some value in that. But for me, there's more value in going, what about the next moment? What about the moment 15 years from now? Am I going to be glad I made this decision? There's an individual in the New Testament that our introduction to is very brief. We meet him, we kind of start to think highly of him, and then he's dead very quickly. But he is a guy that I think is a crucial part of the story of the church, the story of Christianity. It's a person that I think you and I should often be grateful lived and decided what story he was going to tell ahead of time, because it informed him on how he would move and ultimately affect history forever. His name is Stephen. And we don't talk about him a lot. He's not usually named as one of the disciples, and he didn't write any of the New Testament, so he kind of gets lost in there sometimes. But near the very beginning of a guy named Luke, when he not only wrote the gospel, he wrote this book that he called the Acts of the Apostles, which is really about the beginning of the church. He starts very close with Stephen's story and the way Stephen decided to tell it. Let me introduce you to Stephen just so you get a flavor of who he is. In Acts 6, we read, Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, performed amazing miracles and signs among the people. But one day, some men from the synagogue of freed slaves, as it was called, started to debate with him. They were Jews from Cyrene, Alexandria, Cilicia, and the province of Asia. And then we read, none of them could stand against the wisdom and the spirit with which Stephen spoke. We're going to talk about Stephen in a minute, but first I want to talk about these folks that show up from all different parts of the world. They were the religious people. What's so interesting about the religious people in the first century is they didn't like Christian people. They didn't really like Jesus. They didn't really like any of his followers. They certainly didn't like anybody that would sit with religious people and encourage them to reconsider who Jesus is. And I'm convinced it's not because they just really were passionate about their beliefs. I think the religious people were really passionate about their power. They were really passionate about their influence. And if these people keep running around telling people about Jesus being God and him dying and coming back to life and forgiving sins and it's grace and mercy, we can't have that. There's got to be rules. And there's got to be punishment for breaking rules. I mean, we have a society to run, right? I think that's what they got locked in on. They come from all over the world because they're thinking about one thing, nothing broad, but very specific. Me. And how this is going to affect me. They are navigating what a lot of us navigate in our regular everyday life. It's something called focalism. You can look this up. It's legit. I'm not making that word up. Focalism is when we have a situation and cognitively we gain a bias for a specific component of a much larger equation. So not unlike when you sit down with a connect the dots page. Sometimes we get so focused on where is dot number one, and we miss the larger picture. We've zeroed in so narrowly, and we've gotten so bent on one piece that we miss the rest. It's kind of like when you miss the forest for the trees, so to speak. So you go through your day, you have unlimited numbers of things that happen, but you get locked in on the one bad thing. So the whole day was a bad one. If you've ever given a presentation at work, this is true for me. 99% of you could come up to me and say, "That was such a great talk. Thanks, it was so helpful. I'm going to go, become a missionary now," or whatever. But if one person comes to me and has a problem with what I said, guess what I'm thinking about for the rest of my life? The one person. Because I get focused on that, and I miss the bigger picture. It's not unlike when you look through a lens on a camera. There's no lens in the world that can capture the full picture. It can only capture a piece of it. So you have to make decisions about what you're going to include in the frame and not. You see this every day of your life because you've probably been to a concert, you've been to a tourist location, you've been at a birthday party where a little baby's turning 1, and you have seen everybody not paying a lick of attention to what is actually going on. You know what they're doing instead? Recording it through their phone. We don't watch anything take place anymore without a screen between us and the real thing. Have you ever noticed this? I mean, people will bump into each other. And they'll bump into walls because they can't see the bigger picture. All they can see is what's in that little screen on their phone. And we go, "Well, I don't want to forget this and I don't want to miss this." But you are missing it. And have you ever thought about the fact we record all this stuff and then never watch it again? Why are we doing that? I mean, a fireworks show is happening and you're just locked in with your screen as if you're going to go watch the fireworks show again. But we think we're going to miss something, so we got to focus in, we got to get locked in, and in some way, I think the phone helps us do that. This is life. We're seeing our challenges and our problems and the low points in the day through a lens that does not allow us to see everything that's around it. So the religious leaders, they just get locked in on the fear of losing control. So they cook up this whole plan of having Stephen arrested, and they're going to bring him before the high priest, and they're going to challenge that he should no longer be allowed out with the people because he's going to do harm more than he's going to do good. And so this trial starts, and this is what we read happens there. The lying witnesses said, "This man is always speaking against the holy temple and against the law of Moses. We have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy the temple and change the customs Moses has handed down to us." You can hear them hinting at power. Then the high priest asked Stephen, "Are these accusations true?" And in this moment, Stephen faces a dilemma. Will I get very acute in my view and understanding of what's happening and what my options are, or am I going to look at a broader picture? Here's why that's the temptation. This is literally, his answer is literally a life and death choice. If he denies it, or he answers a different question, or somehow tries to get around the pointed question, he could live. But if he says any of that is true, it's on the same level as treason. You are not going to make it much longer. Imagine for a minute if that's all that Stephen could see. I'll promise you, it would be all I could see. I want to believe that I'm a big holy roller and it's Jesus, Jesus all the way, no matter what you say. I wish that was me. But in this moment, I think I would be afraid and I'd wuss out. I'd do what Peter did when Jesus was on trial. I think a lot of us would. And that's how a lot of choices feel. There's that kind of weight behind them all the time. Whether they actually are big decisions or small decisions, we focus in on one piece. And I'll show you how this can affect your understanding of the bigger picture. You want to take a guess at what we're looking at here? We are super zoomed in, a very expensive camera, zoomed way further in than any of our eyes could see. Anybody want to guess? East, you can yell if you want from way far. We'll hear you. Anybody? Red pepper. Some people think a tomato. Some people think it might be, I heard Ferrari, which is unfortunate because there's a problem in the paint if that's a Ferrari. Here's what it actually is. Think about this. What you're actually looking at is a little metal disc on top of a glass bottle, and some of you thought it was a vegetable. Why? Because you're looking at it like this. We're not pulled back far enough where we go, what's the whole story? What's the whole picture? And so often, we are caught up in these decisions that are right in front of us, and we can't see around it. And we're not thinking about chapters 14, 15, 16. We're just thinking about this one word that's right in front of us right now. You see, Stephen could have zoomed way in and chose his options over his story. He could have thought through, okay, option A, I say it's true and I die. Option B, I lie through my teeth, say none of it's true, they're all making it up, and I get out of here to fight another day. Option 3, I get fuzzy with it and hopefully confuse them. Sometimes maybe what went through his head was option 4, I ask God to send angels to immediately wipe all of these people out or something crazy like that. Like he probably thought through all of these, and he could have zeroed in on one, and no one would have blamed him, I don't think, if he would have chose, I just want to live. I just want to live. But at some point, Stephen asks this question, and it's not written in Acts, but I have to believe, because of how he responds, that initially he started with, what story do I want to tell? What do I want to be true when I'm just a blip on the larger story that Jesus is telling? Because his response is not yes, it's not no, it's not maybe, it's not, well, sort of, kinda. Stephen tells a story. In fact, he tells a very long story. If you look at it in Acts, we've made it into almost an entire chapter, Stephen's response. And it goes something like this. He starts way back at the beginning with Abraham. Let me tell you about your ancestors and my ancestors. And then he moves on to guys like Joseph, and he talks about David and Solomon and all these guys, and he's tracing through this whole story until he gets to Jesus. Because what he's trying to convey to them is that we are just a moment in a much larger story of God's faithfulness and mercy and kindness and love. And I'm trying to help you understand that if you were to pull back away from just the threat you're feeling from me, you would see that God has been showing up over the course of history, and that maybe, just maybe, he's trying to tell us something in our little chapter. Not what anybody expected. And this is why I think he asked, what story do I want to tell? I'm going to tell the story of Jesus. And at some point, my story and his story intersected, and that changed everything. He started to influence how I respond to people, how I relate to people, how I do my job, how I'm neighbors with the people on my street. He changed everything. So Stephen tells this really nice story, but the ending is a punch in the face. I mean, Stephen does not hold back one bit at all, and I'm convinced that it's the next few sentences that ultimately get him killed. He says, "You stubborn people, you are heathen at heart and deaf to the truth. Must you forever resist the Holy Spirit?" In other words, what Stephen is saying, why do you keep making such terrible choices? You are not listening to the story. You're so focused on yourself that you're missing it, but you have chosen to be deaf, you have chosen to be stubborn, you have chosen to not listen. That was your decision. And then he goes on to say this. That's what your ancestors did, and so do you. Name one prophet your ancestors didn't persecute. They even killed the ones who predicted the coming of the righteous one, the Messiah. And then get this, whom you betrayed and murdered. It wasn't whom you turned over to the Romans and they put him on trial and they executed him. It wasn't the people that, were kind of twisted and they put him to death. It was no, you. That whole story I told you ends with you murdering God himself. We might understand why people picked up some rocks. And ultimately, they do kill Stephen. He dies in this same part of the story. Now, I don't know a lot about murder, but they murder Stephen here. And I think that a lot of times what we read about people who commit that crime is that they got caught up in their emotions. It was the emotions of fear and anger that drove them to come meet up with Stephen in the first place. It was the emotions of the challenge when he says, you murdered him, that drove them to pick up the rocks. It was all of those emotions that drove them to throw enough of them that he ultimately died. And Stephen became the first, what we call a martyr, someone that was killed for what they believed about Jesus. The funny thing about emotions is they prevent us from seeing the big picture altogether. It's not that we're zoomed in. It's that we can't even see beyond what we're feeling in this moment. And some of the dumbest decisions I've ever made are ones that I made emotionally. I'm an emotional person. This is just a fact about me. I'm glad water gets splashed on my face in the baptism tank because I am very teary in there. And then, this team leads us in singing from like their bones, and I'm standing in the back trying to hold it together because I know I got to come out here. I'm an emotional person, which that's great, but sometimes it drives me to make emotional decisions that later I regret because it's like I just see red or I just see fog. You know what it's like to drive in something like this. It's terrifying because you can't see the brakes in front of you. You can't see the turn up ahead. You can't see the exit sign or the stop sign. It's all right here. You can't see the destination. When we get caught up in our emotions, it causes us to do drastic things that ultimately I believe we wish we could undo. That when we get a few more chapters into the story, we wish we could go back and take away the one we messed up. So asking ourselves this question of what is the story that I want to tell, hopefully helps us lift the fog. We're not just going to allow ourselves to be angry and sad and frustrated and lost in that and a victim to whatever the circumstances are in our life. We're going to go, I want to get there, so I am going to reverse engineer a series of decisions so that I can get there. If you were here last week, and if you missed it, you can watch online. We've got it all there for you. We talked about how our decisions don't just impact us. This is so important because there are going to be other characters in your story. There were for Stephen. There was an individual there the day he was killed that heard his story, watched him make the decision of, I'm going to tell a different kind of story in this moment. And I believe it was the beginning of a life that changed forever, that ultimately allowed our lives to be changed forever. This is what we read at the very end. His accusers took off their coats, Stephen's accusers, and they laid them at the feet of a young man named Saul. If you know anything about that young man, you know that not long after this moment, he meets Jesus on the road to a town called Damascus. And Jesus says, I am going to turn your life upside down. I want you to now build churches in my name. I want you to tell people, you have been fighting against me for so long, and now I want you to fight for me. And we're going to call you Paul. And Paul, if you don't know, would go on to write most of the New Testament. Most of what we read, aside from the Gospels and a few very short letters, most of it is Paul's letters to the churches that he helped start all over. Now, we don't have this. When Jesus shows up, we don't read anywhere that Stephen's story was part of Paul's story. But I'm pretty sure it was. I think this was the beginning. And when Jesus shows up, the light bulb goes off because the wires had already been run. He'd seen what Jesus could do to somebody, what his story could do in another person's story. Stephen never got to tell his own, but Luke did, and Paul did. And anybody that has become a Christian since has. 2,000 some odd years later, you're sitting here and I'm standing here, and we're talking about a guy who asked himself this question: what story do I want to tell? So, what do you do with this? Ask it. When you find yourself in a difficult decision, when you find yourself in a moment where all you can see is your feelings and your anxiety and all of that, pause long enough to ask yourself, when this moment is just a story that's being told, what story do I want it to be? For me, when I started asking myself this question, it did not make my problems go away. It did not make my difficult chapters end. But it helped me navigate them in a particular way because I knew where it wanted to go, where I wanted it to go. So if you're in the midst of a really difficult relational turmoil kind of thing, and you ask yourself, well, what story do I want to tell? The answer to that question might be, I want to tell the greatest love story that's ever been told. Here's the good news. When you decide I'm going to tell the story like Stephen told the story, and my story is going to be a Jesus story, you can tell the greatest love story ever told no matter how they respond. Because that's what Jesus did. Jesus stood up and said, I love you no matter what you think about me. That's the power of aligning our story with his. He doesn't make everything go away, but he helps us through his example and through his words know what the story should look like. Know what chapters, when we face challenges, need to be written. So ask yourself on a very regular basis, what story do I want to tell? And not tomorrow. What do I want to tell my grandson when we're driving in the car home from a ball game and he asks me about this moment in my life? What story do I want to tell him? When my granddaughter asks me about when I started dating, what story do I want to tell? When my kids face really difficult financial situations or difficult moments at work, what stories do I want to tell them from my own life? I promise you, you start allowing Jesus to inform some of those things, you won't have regrets. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for being a God that gives us an example, a template. And while there are going to be an innumerable number of things that we will face in our life that we don't have record of you facing, Jesus, we know at least how you would view those choices and those decisions and those difficult circumstances. And so we're going to ask that you give us the strength and the wisdom and the prudence to ask, which story do we want to tell? And that you will make it clear how we can align that with yours. We love you. Amen.